Hey guys, this is Miss Doherty. We are getting ready to do your very first recorded note session for apes, and we're going to start with a pretty easy topic, ease our way into the year. So we're starting with Ecology of Ecosystems, which is chapter 3 in your book. This is just basically a review of ecology stuff from your biology class. And the first thing I wanted to start with is just a basic reminder of these different levels of the hierarchy of living things in an ecosystem. So the lowest level that we would start with today is just at the organism level. And the next step up from that would be when you have all the different members of the same type of organism living together that can all breed with each other. That's part of a species. So to be in the same species, you actually have to be able to breed and make fertile offspring. And there's one little weird exception to that rule. It's those hybrids. If you remember talking about hybrids in biology, sometimes you have a weird instance where two different species can have babies. Like your classic example is a donkey and a horse can have a mule. But they are not in the same species because the mule is infertile. So, anyways, to be in the same species, you have to be able to have fertile offspring. The next step up from that is a population. That's all the members of a species living together in the same area, and I will show you an example of that on the next slide. Community are all of your different populations living together in the same area, so all of your different groups of living things. The ecosystem level is where we're going to incorporate both living and non-living aspects of a particular area. And then the highest that we go is the biosphere, which is just takes into consideration everything on Earth that is considered a living thing is all part of our biosphere. Okay, and then just some other basic terms that we should hopefully remember. Biotic means living, bio means life, that's why biology is the study of life. Abiotic, A in front of a word means non or not, so that's not living. And we're going to look at a picture on the next slide and identify examples of each. Oops, in an ecosystem. We'll come back to that in a second. Okay, so in this picture they want us to look at this ecosystem and decide which factors are biotic and which ones are abiotic. So that's easy, just which things are living, which things are non-living. And I'll just kind of put an A or a B next to them. So we'll start with biotic. Biotic, first thing that sticks out to me is this big huge tree. The producer is living. That's biotic. Mr. Fox over here is biotic. Rabbit is biotic. What about these little decomposers? Well, they're probably bacteria or fungus, most likely bacteria. So they are living things. They are biotic. And that is really all I'm seeing for now. Some other producers. We have some other plants here. And then let's look and see what else we have. We have precipitation is abiotic. Falling leaves and twigs, if they are now dead, if they are now separate from the living tree, they are now abiotic. Water is abiotic. Oxygen abiotic. CO2 abiotic. Sunlight abiotic. And then the minerals down here are abiotic. Okay, and then of course the soil that all this stuff is in is abiotic as well. So that's easy stuff. Let's go back and look at this other diagram real quick. So just to remind you of these levels real fast. Bottom level we said was organism, and they went from organism to population. They kind of skipped over. Remember we had species here. So species would be other members that are like this organism here that can breed and make fertile offspring with him or her. Okay, so organism to species, and then the next step up from that is population. That's all the members of a species that live together in the same area. So in this area, I like to talk about all the white-tailed deer that live in Northern Virginia. That's a good example of a population. We could say all the white-tailed deer in Prince William County because they're all a member of the same species in the same area. The next step up from that is the community, all the living things in Prince William County, all the deer, all the squirrels, all the raccoons, all the mushrooms, all the trees. Those are all community. Ecosystem is living and non-living stuff, and then biosphere is all life on Earth. Okay, a couple other basic terms. A niche or a niche, if you want to be fancy. We say it's basically an organism's role in the ecosystem, all of its roles or jobs that it fulfills. So its place on the food chain, where it gets its food, how it eats, where it gets its water, where it mates, all those kinds of things are part of its niche. And then a habitat is just the place where the organism lives. So maybe it's in a hole in the ground under a particular tree, but that's the habitat. So role, job, and its address where it lives. Okay, and then this is just talking about, just remember when you see the term ecosystem, we are talking about living and non living being incorporated together. And then this is just saying that we have lots of different things that we could consider ecosystems. So it says a cave, a lake. These could be ecosystems where we actually see a distinctive boundary around them. We can say, okay, at the end of the cave, that ecosystem is over, or at the edge of the lake, that ecosystem is over. And this is saying, however, most ecosystems, you don't have a specific boundary where it stops and the next one begins. They kind of bleed into each other. Okay, so here's an example. Here you have your national park where, humans have made this nice little outline around it, but in reality, organisms can still come and go. So we've kind of created our own little human-made boundary, but again, a lot of ecosystems bleed into surrounding ecosystems. And then this is kind of cool because it shows you that, again, any little a puddle on the ground, or here we have a little pond in a tree, a little hole in a tree, that's considered its own ecosystem because it's got its own system of living things, and then of course it's got a lot of abiotic factors going on in there, like water, minerals, dead things. So this is an ecosystem just as much as this is an ecosystem. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to talk about energy flow. So this is kind of the main topic of these notes. So we'll start with the basics of photosynthesis and respiration. So I'm sure we all remember these topics from since very early science classes. But anyways, photosynthesis is the process in which producers, which are autotrophs are self-feeders, anything that has chlorophyll and can make its own food, they use sun's energy, so they use the UV energy from the sun to produce chemical energy in the process called photosynthesis. And so plants make their own food to power themselves, but then also we know that you can have heterotrophic organisms or consumers come along to actually gain the energy from those autotrophs as well. And remember, the process of photosynthesis, we're going from the sunlight energy and we're actually creating chemical energy when we create the glucose for that plant. Okay? The chemical energy comes from the chemical bonds within the glucose molecule. So we do need to be familiar with the inputs and outputs of this process as well as respiration. And I think I actually have a little bit better diagram of that. Yeah, I have a better diagram of this on this page. So photosynthesis, we said, is performed by organisms that have chloroplasts and chlorophyll, and they can capture sunlight's energy. So that's going to be things like plants, algae, and some bacteria. We need the energy of the sunlight to enter the system. They need to take in CO2 gas and H2O water. And then their products are going to be oxygen gas, and then C6H12O6. You should kind of remember this formula. That stands for glucose. Okay, and again, this is where that chemical energy comes into play. The solar UV energy is turned into chemical energy in the glucose. All right, so that's pretty basic. Now, respiration is the opposite process of that in terms of the chemical reaction. So everything that was an input or a reactant in photosynthesis is now a product, and vice versa. Everything that's a product here is an input or a reactant of respiration. So an important thing you should know about respiration is all organisms do respiration. Every single type of organism. Plants, animals, fungus, bacteria, everything does respiration. And respiration is going to be what allows us to do all of the daily activities that we need to do. Eat, move around, think, breathe, all of that stuff is powered by this respiration process. So oxygen gas is breathed into the organism. The organism has to take in glucose, sugar, to power respiration. And then the outputs here, we breathe out CO2 gas. We also produce a water waste. And most importantly, the whole point of doing respiration is to create that energy. And again, that's going to power all of our day-to-day functions. Okay, here's some different types of eaters we should hopefully remember. A carnivore is just an organism that consumes other consumers. Herbivore eats only vegetation. Omnivore is what we are, organisms that eat both plants and other consumers. A scavenger is going to go around and eat the dead carcasses of other animals. So, your textbook example of that is like a hyena, a vulture, those sorts of things. Detritivore might be a new term for you. A detritivore is something that ingests detritus. Detritus is like broken down dead stuff, so like leaf litter, plant remains, and dung, aka poop. Okay, so these things go around and they just kind of eat away at the dead stuff that's laying around the bottom of the forest floor and leftover poop that's laying around. And then you have a very, very, very important part of your ecosystem. One of the most important parts of your ecosystem are your decomposers. Those are going to be your bacteria and your fungi. They work at the microscopic level. They chemically break down any organic matter that's kind of left over that's laying around. We call them the recyclers of the ecosystem because they break down those nutrients, they return them back into the soil, and they provide nutrients to start the whole process over again for the producers, the plants. Plus, they break down all that dead stuff out in the environment so we don't have a bunch of dead carcasses laying everywhere. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at food chains, food webs, and the trophic levels within them. So again, these are all terms that we remember from previous classes, but we've already talked about a heterotroph. That's an other feeder. They cannot make their own food. They have to get their energy from somewhere else. And in a food web, we call them consumers, and we have various levels of consumers. So your first level of consumer is called a primary consumer, and a lot of times this is written as, it looks like 1 degree. Secondary consumer, a lot of times is written as 2 degree. So your primary consumer is going to be eating just plants, just producers, and so those are going to be your herbivores. Your secondary consumer eats the primary consumers, and then your tertiary consumer, a lot of times that might be your top level, they're going to eat the secondary consumer. So these upper level guys are definitely carnivores because they're eating other consumers. Okay, here is a typical, this is actually a food web. We can look at individual food chains within it, but it does a good job of showing you the different levels, and the boxes are kind of in the way of our things. Let me see if I can move them a little bit. They're all connected. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so we have your decomposers down here at the bottom. We'll come to them at the end. You always start your food webs or food chains with producers. You always have to start with something that is able to make its own food. And so I'll show you different examples of food chains and food webs, some on land and some in the water. But in a terrestrial land-dwelling type of ecosystem, it's going to be your grasses, shrubs, trees, those sorts of things are your producers. And then your primary consumers are the things that eat the plants. So they're your herbivores. So here it's the rabbits, mice, seed-eating birds, and deer. And then secondary would be the next step up from them. And then, so these guys are going to be secondary consumers in some of these food chains, but they'll be tertiary consumers in some of the other ones. So for instance, if we go from shrub to mice to mountain lion, this is producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer. He's secondary consumer in that one, but we could probably find him as a tertiary consumer. Let me see. Well, okay, well, I'm not seeing them indicated as a tertiary consumer in this one, so, but you would have your secondary and tertiary consumers at the very top. I have some other ones where I can show you the tertiary consumer at the top. This is just kind of a simplified version of that. And then everything, once it dies, it's all coming down here, and it's all getting broken down by the bacteria and the fungus. Okay, so these are food chains again, and I'll show you how food chain and food web are different. But here's a typical terrestrial food chain. So again, a land-dwelling food chain. Your grasses are your producers. Your zebra is your primary consumer here because he eats grass. He's an herbivore. And then your lion is a secondary consumer because he eats the zebra. An aquatic food chain, algae a lot of times are your producers because algae's little microscopic protists actually, but they're plant-like because they do photosynthesis. They float around in the water. You have little zooplankton that are the primary consumers that eat the algae. Then you have fish that eat the zooplankton, so they're the secondary consumer. And then you have a bald eagle that eats the secondary consumer. He's the tertiary consumer. He's the top predator. And notice the flow of arrows. They go, they go upward, so they're showing the flow of energy to the organism that's doing the eating. Okay, so we just looked at a bunch of food chains. Food chains are just kind of showing you one line of events. We don't have the whole entire ecosystem linked together. The whole entire ecosystem's eating habits are going to be shown in the food web, which I think I have a picture of on the next slide. A really, really, really important thing you should know about a food chain is that they rarely have more than 5 links. And that is because as we make our way up to each progressive level, we're going to lose energy. And we lose energy due to the second law of thermodynamics, which states that when we do energy transitions, they're always inefficient and we always lose that waste heat energy to the environment. Okay, so this is a food web. The food web is going to show lots of these different eating relationships as opposed to just one chain of events, which would just be the food chain. So if we did grasses to hare to cheetah, that's a food chain. If we do all of these intermixed, that's your food web. Okay, ecosystem productivity. We need to learn a couple of terms and their little abbreviations here. So we need to know what the GPP is. GPP is gross primary productivity. That's going to be the total amount of energy that plants can capture from the solar energy coming into them through the process of photosynthesis. So GPP is the highest amount of energy that the plants have to work with once they've gone through photosynthesis. This is still a pretty inefficient process because it says only about 1% of the sun's energy that reaches the earth is actually converted into the chemical energy in the process of photosynthesis. And I have a picture of that, I believe. I have a picture of that here, but let's do this other slide and then we'll come to that in 1 second. Now, so GPP is the highest amount of energy that a plant can capture in the process of photosynthesis. The NPP, or net productivity, is the energy captured, so GPP, minus the energy respired. So basically that means it is the GPP minus respiration. And that's what, if we come down here, that's what our actual equation is. Net productivity is just the gross minus respiration. Okay? And so we've talked a little bit about respiration already. We said plants do respiration as well. Respiration is just that process where we break down glucose to make energy from. We know it as the process of metabolism, and that's going to give us energy to do all of our daily functions like growing, staying alive, those sorts of things. So a plant captures the amount of solar energy in GPP. It has to do respiration to do its daily processes, and when we subtract that out, you get your NPP. Okay, this is also going to be the amount of energy that can be passed up to the next level of a food chain. That's going to be, the NPP is the amount of energy that gets passed up to the next consumer in a food chain. Okay, so this diagram is showing us, here we have the sun. Here you have 99% of all that solar energy that's coming in is actually not being absorbed by the plants. Okay, so only 1% of that incoming solar radiation is actually being absorbed by the plants and being used to do photosynthesis. And so that's the energy going into GPP. So GPP, plants capture that. They convert it into chemical energy. However, plants have to do daily functioning, so they lose 60% of that to respiration. So it says usually only about 40% will actually go into the net productivity, which is going to be able to be passed on to the next level of the food chain, to whatever consumer comes along to eat it. Okay? And a good example of trying to remember this, if you guys have jobs and you earn a paycheck, you have your gross sum that you start off with. So you first get your paycheck, you're like, yes, I am rich. I have so much money. But then you look after they take all the taxes out and you see your net pay. The net pay is what you actually get. So that's very similar to this. Okay, gross, subtract the respiration, net is what you actually get. Okay, a couple more energy terms before we look at some pyramids. A lot of times when we talk about how much energy you actually see at a particular level in a food chain, we call that the biomass. Okay, so we can measure energy in terms of biomass. And if you hear us talking about a standing crop, that is, if we were to take a snapshot or a picture of an ecosystem at any given time, that would be the actual amount of biomass that ecosystem possesses at one instance in time. Okay? And then ecological efficiency, when we get to our last pyramid, the energy pyramid, that's going to show us how energy flows from one level to the other. And we're going to learn that you always have to have more energy on the bottom to be able to support the organisms at the top. So you always have the most energy at the bottom of a food pyramid. Okay, so now we're going to look at 3 different types of pyramids. And again, it's just we have to keep that second law of thermodynamics in mind, and it's kind of what I just said. Since we're always losing waste heat energy to the environment, we always have to have more energy at the bottom. So it's saying most pyramids are narrower towards the top because they lose energy as they make their way up. Okay, the first type of pyramid is called a pyramid of numbers. It's exactly like it sounds. If we were to go outside in the field behind the school and count how many producers we have, count how many primary consumers, count how many secondary consumers, we would, tally those up, collect our data, and we could put those into a numbers pyramid. Okay, so in a field type environment, again, you have lots of grasses compared to only a handful of these mice, and then to only just very few of those birds of prey. Now, you can have some weird things happen with pyramids of numbers. A lot of them, again, like a grassland, because you're counting each individual piece of grass, the bottom's going to be much bigger. However, sometimes when you're dealing with an ecosystem like a forest, where your producers are really big trees that can support a lot of these higher levels, sometimes you'll see what we call an inverted pyramid, where you have only a few very large trees supporting a lot of primary consumers, a lot of secondary consumers, and then usually at the top, you always usually have a very small number of top predators in any sort of ecosystem. Okay, pyramid of biomass, we just talked about that standing stock. If we were to take a snapshot in time and see how much energy we actually have at each level at a given moment, that's what the pyramid of biomass represents. Okay, so again, if we were to go out behind the school and take a snapshot and see how much energy we have in each level. And by the way, how you would do this is we could go out to the grassy area. We would collect all the grasses within a roped off area and all the plants and all the producers, and we would bring them in, and we don't have one of these things, but there's a drying oven, a fancy drying oven where you dry out the plants and then you actually mass them, and you see how much mass and how much energy each of these different levels would have. Okay, so this is measured in joules per meter squared, and again, oftentimes you have a wider base at the bottom and it gets smaller as you go up. Now, there is one exception to that. You can have an inverted biomass pyramid as well, and here's your type of example that would have that. So it says in open waters of an aquatic ecosystem, like out in the ocean, sometimes the biomass of primary consumers, like zooplankton, can exceed that of producers, like regular plankton, phytoplankton or algae. Okay, phytoplankton, basically fancy word for algae. Says the zooplankton eat the producers, the algae, the phytoplankton, just as fast as they reproduce. So their population is never able to get large at any given time. So basically, these little algae are the little teeny tiny microscopic things. Almost as quickly as they're being produced, the zooplankton are snatching them up and eating them just as fast. So at any one given instance, you don't have a large population of them because they're being produced and eaten very quickly. However, the energy that they produce and they provide to the higher levels, the energy flow, you'd always have more energy down at the bottom than here. But again, at one particular instance, one particular snapshot, not going to have that many. Now again, a grassy area, lots of energy in the grasses to support the upper levels. Okay, and then the last type of pyramid is a pyramid of energy, and this represents the flow of energy. And with the flow of energy, you're always going to have more energy at the bottom to be able to flow up to the top levels. And this is measured in a unit of time. So the last one we said, how many joules do you have per meter squared? And joules is a measure of energy. This is going to be joules per meter squared per year. Okay, so again, this is over a period of time. Okay, so here's some issues with the pyramid of energy. It says as we move up to each trophic level, only about 10% of the energy is actually usually transferred up to the next highest level. That means that most energy, 90% of the energy, is actually used for everyday functions that we need in metabolism. And again, we know that comes from respiration process. Okay, so here's why you would lose energy as we move up the trophic levels. The consumer may not be able to digest or eat all of the organism. The consumer may have had to expand energy to actually go out and catch the prey. And the consumer loses thermal energy, again, due to that second law of thermodynamics. So, again, we're always losing energy as we go up the trophic levels in a food chain. We usually only retain 10%. I'm going to skip over that because I want to get to this one. So this is a good graphic, and it does a really good job of showing you that 10% rule, how only 10% makes it up to the next level. Um, so a lot of times you don't see sunlight at the bottom, but they've shown you that, of course, all energy is going to start with sunlight on this planet. So if you're incoming sunlight, your producer down here at the bottom, we have your flour. We're going to start with 10,000 joules of energy here. And then you have Mr. Grasshopper comes and eats part of the flour. So he's going to be the primary consumer. He gets 10% of 10,000 joules, so he gets 1,000 joules of energy. Then Mr. Mouse comes along and eats the cricket. He gets 10% of the 1,000 joules, so he's going to get 100 joules of energy. And then finally, your top predator, the snake, gets 10% of the 100 joules, so he gets 10 joules of energy. So, as we said, you typically don't see a food chain that's more than 4 or 5 links long because, look, we would run out of that initial energy that we had captured from the producer level. Okay, and then the final thing, and we'll actually have an entire day talking about this in the next week or so, is something called bioaccumulation or biomagnification. Um, This actually kind of works opposite of what we just said. We said that with energy, you only retain 10% as you go up to each successive level. With biomagnification, we're talking about a toxic substance and how it moves up the levels of a food chain. And ironically, what happens with these toxic substances is they don't decrease in concentration as they move up a food chain. They actually increase big time as you go up the different levels, okay? And the different types of toxic substances I'm talking about, mercury is a big one, DDT, as you can see here in this picture, and we'll talk all about that with Rachel Carson. So these toxic substances, they're very stable and they stick around in ecosystems for a long time. So you can see here in this graphic, if you have even just a little bit of DDT in the water, it says you have this really small decimal and it's ppm, parts per million. So you've got this chemical floating around the water. It accumulates in the bodies of little zooplankton, little animal-like plankton in the water. And you can see as it accumulates, it's actually already increased its concentration drastically from the water to the organism. And the organism is going to store it in its body tissues. And then you have small fish who are eating the zooplankton, and when they're eating the zooplankton, they're really probably only eating affected zooplankton from this one body of water. So again, it's going to accumulate in higher concentration in the next level of the food chain. And then you have larger fish that are going to eat these smaller fish that, again, they're only eating stuff that's been contaminated in this body of water. So you're going to see that concentration rise at the next level of the food chain to 2 parts per million already. And then who's really hurt by this process are your top predators, here the predatory birds. So again, for the same reason, if this chemical is accumulating in the body tissue, and these birds are doing most of their hunting in this affected water that's had all these organisms that have accumulated this chemical in higher concentrations as they go up the chain, they're going to have really high concentrations of DDT. And again, with Rachel Carson, we've talked about the consequences of that. And we talked about how it affected their eggshells and how it affected the entire bird population. So it actually increased 10 million times as we went from this concentration in the water to the 25 parts per million at the top predator. So again, we'll talk a lot more about that because it's a really important concept for this class, but the accumulation of chemicals goes in the opposite direction than the energy does. Energy, we only retain 10% as we go up to each successive level. Bioaccumulation, we actually are increasing a lot of times by, up to 10% as we go to the next level. All right, and that's where we're going to finish with our notes today, and I will see you guys in class.